The next item in our agenda is the Capstone panel, which is really the highlight, one of the big highlights of the event. It really gives everyone an opportunity to question some of the keynote speakers around, including Mr. Bello Asagi. So I'll have to welcome you back on again.
So our Capstone panel this morning is going to be moderated by Lanre Akinola. Lanre is a great friend of CABN. He supported us over the years. He's the editor at the This is Africa magazine, which is a Financial Times publication. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lanre. Please give him a round of applause.
Thanks a lot, Martin. I had a chance to chat to Martin before the panel, and he asked me, he didn't mention it now, he asked me who my pick was for the World Cup. And with a name like mine, that's always a tricky question to answer, because if you dare say it's not Nigeria, you're in trouble. That said, I think I'm going to go for Africa, and let's see how let's see how that works out. Allow me to start by thanking the steering committee for inviting me yet again to be a part of the business conference. It's always a pleasure to come up to Cambridge. And allow me to also commend Cambridge University in general for its very proactive engagement with Africa. It's a young engagement, but it's a very committed one. And from my interaction with the university, there's a lot more to come. And that sort of the swell of activity around Cambridge, there's always a buzz around Africa, is of course reflective of the bigger trend that is currently unfolding around Africa. As we all know, it's been a good decade, relatively speaking. It's certainly been a better decade than we have had in the past. And correct or not, the narrative around Africa is starting to drift away from one of chronic instability, chronic underperformance, and chronic underdevelopment to one of potential, both in economic terms, in social terms, and political terms. And no matter where you stand on the debate, it's undeniable that things are changing. Whether it's the mobile phone revolution, of which our keynote speaker is a part, whether it's the boundless potential of its agriculture sector or its mouth-watering demographics, Africa is moving from the margins to the mainstream of the global debate on trade, investment, and growth. Now, as good as that is, that also comes with problems. Africa Rising is a theme that all of us in this room will be familiar with. And as great as that is for the PR game, it also glosses over the nuance of what's driving this success story or perceived success story in Africa. And this is really what I'd like to drill down into with this morning's panel. And we have a stellar lineup of speakers who can speak to some of these issues of how really do we need to understand the African growth story, and how really do we need to understand and should we understand what's driving it, and how we can make sure that the perceived success of Africa is not only sustained but consolidated into very real success in the coming years and decades. Allow me to very briefly introduce our panelists before we go into the discussion. The format will be pretty standard. We have 60 minutes for today. Now, George said he wants to stick to the schedule. We're already about 25 minutes behind, so I'm assuming we're going to run over by about 15 to 20 minutes. Okay, great. Joining me we have 60 minutes, and the first 35 minutes or so will be spent discussing amongst the panel. And then, of course, we're going to go over to you, the audience, to get your comments, your thoughts, and your questions, because we want as much participation from you as possible. Quick introductions before we get started with the actual discussion. To my immediate right is Akin Urumakinde, who is the CEO of Delta Afrique Engineering. To his right is Enase Okonedo, who is the Dean of the Lagos Business School. We have Hakim Bello Asagi, who've already been introduced and has spoken. And the reason I come to Matt last is he's CEO of Africa Prudential, but he's also proof that this isn't a Nigeria panel. And Matt, I'd like to actually start the discussion with you. Now, Prudential is not a new name in Africa. In fact, most of you will know Prudential PLC CEO, very recognizable name and face in Tidjane Thiam. Prudential has had phenomenal success in emerging markets, especially Asia in recent years, but Africa is now a place that is becoming of more importance. And you've been given the mandate to lead the business for Prudential in Africa. And it would be great to start with a perspective of a UK company, international company, that is building a presence in Africa, that is engaging with the continent, and get your sense of what's really driving this, and how should we understand the perceived success we've seen over the last decade or so, and how is that informing the business of companies like Prudential?
Thanks, Landry. I'll say a little bit about our company and how we got to the place that we are and why we're doing what we're doing. We're a very old company. We've been operating for 165 years. We're very well known in the UK, but over the last 20 years we've been growing a business in Southeast Asia, and that is now by far our most profitable business, our biggest business, and in terms of the value in our share price, it's probably more than half of the value of the entire company. And that's not in one or two countries, and it's not in the larger and wealthier, more developed economies of Asia. It's broad-based, and it's across some of the more developing economies like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. And the thing that we found across all of those countries over the last 20 years is that despite the wide diversity in many areas of life, human needs are very similar, and desires across all of the countries. Everybody wants to protect against the risk of losing their breadwinner. Everybody aspires to give their children a better education than they had themselves. And these are some of the forces that have driven our business over the last 20 years to phenomenal growth, doubling probably every 3 or 4 years for the last 15 years. And we don't see Africa as any different from that. It's not an emotional decision. It's certainly not an emotional decision by Tijan. It's a business decision. There's a broad-based, growing middle class in most African countries. A broad consumer class of people with the same hopes for the future for themselves and for their children as in any other part of the world, and we just see an opportunity over the next 10 or 15 years to build a successful, profitable business in Africa just as we have in Asia. It's not very emotional, it's very rational, and we as a company are very committed to it. I'll talk later about that, but it's not just, we're not experimenting, we're doing this seriously, and that's why we're going to do it slowly and build the foundations well, and over time build a more profitable, bigger business, but we're not just dipping a toe in the water.
Sure. Well, we'll get back to what's driving the approach of companies like Prudential. But Anas, I'd like to turn to you. Now, Lagos Business School has, in recent years, established itself as one of the top business schools, not just in Africa, but also a school that can hold its own against international competition. But that's a long way from what it was in 1991 when it was set up as something called the Center for Professional Communications. Its rise and success has, in some way, gone hand in hand with the perceived rise and success of Africa over the last 10, 15 years. And as you sort of consider where things are and where things go next, what's really been the driving force behind that? And what would you attribute the success of a school like Lagos Business School to more than anything else?
Thanks very much. I think a number of things. First of all, it's the vision. So when we talk about success, one has to know what are the ways by which we consider that one is successful, or what are the things that you look at. And for me, operating in Nigeria and out of Africa, it goes beyond just in terms of the monetary value that you have. So from the very beginning, our vision was to try and develop competent and socially responsible managers. And in that regard, obviously, you have to make the money in order to do that. But given that that was the vision, we remain focused on doing that. And over the last couple of years, especially in the first 17 years of our existence, we were very much Nigerian-centric, focusing on developing managers for Nigeria because we thought that that was what was needed. But then over the last 5 to 6 years, there have been a number of factors that have caused us to look differently at what it is that we're trying to do. One was the increased interest in Africa When I first joined business school 19 years ago, I would go to conferences and Africa wouldn't even feature when they spoke about the different regions of the world. It was literally the dark continent. But then over the last 10 years, we've seen a change in that, as we've all witnessed. And therefore, with that change, there's been an increasing flux of multinationals and foreign organizations coming to Africa and see how they can partake of the economic growth that comes there. In addition to that, I've also seen what I would term the emergence of regional giants, which are domestic companies that prior to this time played within their domestic economies, now expanding and having footprints all over Africa, which suggested that with the people who were developing in Nigeria, they would someday in the near future find themselves working in other parts of Africa. And therefore, it would require a different level of sophistication and a different set of skills for you to play in that market. Given that our focus is really to develop managers that will help the economic transformation of the continent, we then thought, you know what are we going to do? So I would attribute what we've been able to do so far to an ability to sort of recognize the trends that are shaping the industry, which is not only the management education industry, but also the context in which we operate, and wanting to remain true to that vision of ensuring that we develop managers. Because when we speak about growth on the continent, I always say, when we all talk about these prospects and how, it's the fastest growing region of the world, one thing that I believe scant attention has been paid to is, where's the talent that's going to help us to actualize this growth? And keeping in mind that we need to sort of develop the talent to actualize this growth has been responsible for what you've seen us do over the last couple of years.
Thank you very much, Inasa. We'll get back to some of those issues, especially the question of talent and the role of education. Akin, your company focuses on oil and gas, power, and infrastructure, which is like a triple whammy of difficult sectors to operate in. So I'm particularly looking forward to your perspectives on this question of success and what success in Africa means and what success in an African context means, because all of these sectors, if you look at them, are very tough nuts to crack. And how would you respond to a question along the lines of, hey, what's driving success in Africa and what's driving success in the sectors that you're in?
Thank you, Larry. I founded this company with Wally Parsons, but before then, I've been back in Nigeria it's just June 7, it's been 20 years. And just like Mr. Bello Sagi was saying, Africa is a unique place, and Nigeria is one of those tough African countries. And when I came to Nigeria, he was to operate outside of the norm. A lot of people thought I was stupid and I was taking too much risk. But I studied in America. I read chemical engineering. I worked in the oil industry in the US. And then I came back to Nigeria. I didn't do MBA. I learned MBA through a hard knot. I was, got to be street smart. I came back, I knew what I wanted. I saw opportunities where people saw frustration. As a matter of fact, at the time I came to Nigeria, people were leaving Nigeria to go to America, and I told them they were stupid. In any case, when you start to play by the norm, at the time I came 20 years ago, then I would be just one of the bunch. So we started playing outside of the norm by, like he said, relationship. First, they didn't believe me because I was too American in my thinking, but I could see where I was going, and it was so tangible. And so you have to remain focused and be passionate and be persuasive. I had to engage audience. I had to challenge norms. By challenging norms, you have to create a viable solution. Do not put something down without having alternate solution. So we started to build our business by changing things. For instance, local content. At the time I came to Nigeria, we will see installation in the offshore. We never know how how oil is being produced. We never engage our people. We never train Nigerians. We just see oil, and we're making money, but no Nigerians were employed. And so we started telling them what it would take to engage Nigerians in this business that Nigeria has been running for 30 years. And it took a couple of years, then they started to pay attention. They started with 10%. Let's try and do something like 10% of the work in Nigeria. And this was by force, and because the oil companies were not ready to do it. But then with some determined people within the system that believed there must be a change, they started to pay attention, and they tried us. First time, we recruited 15 Nigerians and sent them to Houston to do 10% of the work that was awarded to our partner. And they came back with sounding good news. And the people in the government that were on the project gave feedback to the NNPC that they needed to do more. And so we started to do all this. And over the years, just like Lagos Business School is developing, we started building talents. Our local content became recruiting young graduates, sending them to Nigerian projects wherever they are all over the world, and then let them start to feel their colleagues and then weigh their reference in terms of knowledge and capability. And the confidence continued to build over time. And today, we have built over 600 engineers of different disciplines. We are currently now in span of 20 years, by local content law says 80% of engineering of FPSO topside must be done in Nigeria. We are assembling the first of its kind in Africa in our office, where about 400 people are employed, and we are proving to ourselves it can be done in Africa.
Thank you very much. Hakeem, thank you so much for your very compelling presentation earlier. Now, if I could use one word to describe it, I would say that I really enjoyed the emphasis on nuance. Now, we all know, we've all heard Africa Rising, we all have our opinion on it. Do you feel that while positive, the interest of some of the hype and buzz around Africa right now misses or glosses over the nuance of what's really going on the continent? Now, obviously, your primary operating market is Nigeria, but I'd be really interested in hearing your perspectives on the wider debate around success in Africa, the perceived economic success of Africa, and the extent to which people are really understanding what's going on the continent.
All right. First of all, I'd like to say that I don't really think it has much to do with the demographic dividend. And I want to say this because this demography has been there for 20 years, right? But the way it was described 15 to 20 years ago was in the following terms. It is an overpopulation problem. And I find it fascinating that what used to be described as an overpopulation problem today is now described as a very good thing. Then people said that 100 million people who have no cash is not a market. I remember hearing this very distinctly from many people. Now you hear 150 million people. What a great thing. All right? Now, my own view as to why we see this growth in Africa, I think, comes from two things, at least. The first is that at independence, through the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s, the primary philosophy of growth in African countries was statist. The government was to take the commanding heights of the economy. Most young people, myself included, the highest honor you could have was to be a senior government official or a university professor, dean, or vice chancellor. My ambition when I was in Cambridge was to be a university professor and an advisor to the government. I stumbled into business, right? And the state corporation was the engine of growth. We had a licensing regime that dominated the countries. And this is the same whether it's in India or Pakistan or Indonesia, it was the same pattern. Now, that model ran into problems as state corporations started losing money. It infested a lot of corruption, it stifled initiative, and somewhere in the late 80s and 1990s, a new model started to emerge. As a lot of these restrictions were taken away, a lot of areas where the government exited, partly because of the budget deficit that they were running, and they needed to stop making a loss, partly because of the new economic philosophy. But what, in my view, you are seeing now is a result of the exit of the government from large sectors of the economy, which allow private individuals, both local and international, to go in and do things that they could not have done before outside of the government. So, for example, a Prudential could not exist easily because there would have been a national insurance corporation that dominated the area. In the oil industry, it would have been the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, which dominated everything with some of the oil companies. So we are seeing that freedom to operate. And that is what is causing that growth. Now, luckily, and I would like to say it is luck, in my view, this is happening at the same time as the Western economies are in recession. All right? So, the new view on Africa, it does have something to do with the fact that if you are in the middle of no growth, admittedly caused by lots of my classmates from Harvard Business School,
True.
who led the world to the brink of financial collapse of the investment and the commercial banks, admittedly. But when you have no growth, it forces you to look at markets that you had written off. And now you say, hey, what about Africa? And I feel that we're very fortunate that these two things happen at the same time. Okay? Now, what is my biggest fear? I have two fears. The first fear is the following, is that you will get an initial amount of growth just from the freeing up of activity. But then there are still things that governments need to do because only governments can do them. One, the fundamental importance of education, of which you are so crucial, and the work that you do is so crucial. Because the expansion in education in a lot of African countries has meant a reduction in quality in education, and therefore a reduction in the number of people that can fill the positions that an expanding economy can provide. That's one. Secondly, they have got to lead in the way in which they structure incentives that develop infrastructure. Because private business doesn't take as much risk as we proclaim we take. Right? We're in actual fact rather cautious because we announce that we are all risk-taking characters. And therefore, there's a lot of infrastructure that is going to be needed. Human infrastructure, physical infrastructure, health as well, which will sustain this growth. That is absolutely crucial. The second worry I have is that there's almost an over-enthusiasm in the West. I mean, I actually have people calling me and saying to me, Kim, I need some Nigerian exposure. It's like sunlight. I need to get some sunlight this summer, I need some Nigerian exposure. And, I was in California at a cocktail party, and the guy said, Mr. Bella said, I've got 3 Nigerian stocks. And I just, in my heart, it sank. My heart sank. So I was kind of wondering, what analysis had he done? Luckily, 2 of the stocks were really good, and 1 was very average, I would say, of the 2 stocks. And so I do worry that an over-enthusiasm without careful analysis, which leads to a problem in one country, could lead to a feeling of, listen, let's short Africa because something has gone wrong in Kenya, something has gone wrong in Morocco, and there will be an exodus.
Now, you've touched on a really key issue here, which is that this is not the first time the world has gotten excited about Africa, and we've had false dawns in the past. Now, Matt, I'd like to turn back to you on this point, because the key question is really, is this time different? And with the way Prudential is approaching the market now, what is different about what is happening on the continent at the moment compared to some of the previous booms and boom cycles that we've seen in decades gone by?
Well, as Hakeem said earlier, very dangerous to stand here and say, well, this time's going to be different, or I'm going to talk to you about why I've been so successful. But I think the first, well, two things really. One is that the absolute level of prosperity is higher after a decade of compound growth. Most African countries are broadly twice as wealthy as they were a decade ago. And that is a much better bedrock starting place on which to build an investment. And then the second thing is that growth has been much broader based. And so the emerging middle class is much broader than it was 10 years ago. As Hakeem said, it's much more driven by people than governments. And so we feel is much more sustainable than perhaps it was 10 years ago.
And in terms of markets, in terms of geographies, what really are the key areas of focus, and where do you see the key opportunities for the strategy that you're looking to deploy?
Long term, it's all about where all the people are, and so the larger markets across Africa are all very attractive. So we've obviously got a business in Ghana. Nigeria is a huge economy, but there are other very large countries too. Angola, Angola's not a large one, but Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda is a very rapidly growing population. North Africa, Egypt is a huge population. So these are all very attractive markets.
Now, Inasa, coming back to you and this issue of education. Now, I would tend to agree with Hakeem's assessment that there's overexcitement and hype at times around what's happening in Africa, and that we sometimes fixate a little bit too much on the GDP growth figures, which are compelling, although even those are arguably not high enough. Education is one of those things that we don't talk about enough, I would argue. What is your perspective on the need to really tackle education more effectively, not just in Nigeria, but across Africa, if we are to sustain the current optimism and the current tide and swell of optimism around the potential that Africa has?
Thanks. I think that there's a lot of work to be done across Africa. So, there's several examples that suggest that a lot more work has to be done. When you look at the pass rates, if you like, of the equivalent of the IGCSEs across schools in Africa, South Africa, in East Africa, we all have problems there. And I think that the starting point remains, first of all, what are the years of compulsory education that an African child that's being born today is expected to get? So you would find that the average across most African countries is about 7 to 8 years of compulsory education. If we compare that to the more developed nations of the world, in which the years of compulsory education is 12 to 13 years, then it suggests that perhaps we're not getting enough education. The second thing that we have to contend with is the economic reality, which plays out in the fact that you have a number of school-age children who go into school. But then if we look at what happens to them between when they enter into school and then when they leave school and then go on to higher education, what happens? I'll use Nigeria and the 2012 figures, for instance. So we have like 20 million school-age children that come into school, when they're 6 years old. By the time they're getting to school leaving age, we've lost about 9 million. We've lost about 11 million. So you find that it's only 9 million people that go into secondary school. And then by the time they're taking the exams to go into higher institutions, it's only 1.7. So we've lost another 7 million along the way. The reality is that those people who drop out of school may be due to any combination that could be cultural factors. But I do believe that the economic situation that forces these children out of school in order to assist their parents to earn a living, to support the other members of the family, have a consequence. That's what happens to them because of the economic situation. But then if you add to that the fact that the education that they're getting, how suitable is that? And how does it prepare the people to help to actualize this growth that we all speak about? And indeed, I differ slightly with Hakeem with respect to the fact that I think that the market itself, this population, is one of the reasons why they're interested, because it's a large market, together with the other two factors that you spoke about. But then when we speak about this and we look at what does the educational system prepare us for, across most of Africa, we inherited an educational system perhaps based on who our old colonial masters were, either British or French and so on and so forth. But one of the things that I've come to realize, especially in my role as the chairperson of the Association of African Business School up until December, is that education has to be contextual and has to take into consideration the needs of those people. So what are the skills that are so needed in this environment that Hakeem described earlier on there, in which there's instability sometimes as well? And he spoke about if one is coming in there and expecting a ready-made system in which the processes are in place, everything works, you have a problem. So we've inherited a system that teaches us to say this is the way it functions in the real world, if you like. You know, everything will go according to this, but that's not Africa. And therefore, the skills such as creativity, such as adaptability, such as the ability to think outside of the box is not inherent in the educational system, which we've inherited and which we still play. So I would say that it does seem to be an onerous task trying to fix this, because it has to be fixed across all levels there. But then we can't address it in isolation. We have to address these problems in the face of addressing the economic issues, things like poverty that face the people there. However, there's a lot we can do, and perhaps later on in the afternoon when we speak about talent development, I would have a few more suggestions in this regard. It's critical anyhow that the problem has to be addressed, and as a matter of urgent importance.
Thank you, Nasir. The issue of education, ultimately, you know, the responsibility for fixing it lies with government, but business, of course, has a vested interest in being proactively engaged with the process of helping to build the talent that is going to fuel and is going to be required to fuel Africa's economies of the 21st century. What's your perspective on how business has to be a part of the solution here when it comes to making sure that growth is sustained?
As a corporate entity, we get involved at the university levels. We engage a lot of interns. We bring them out of school to our offices, and we teach them the real world. And also, I particularly, because of my own background, I took on a foundation called Impact Your World, just to literally go into universities and bring the real world to universities so that they can also prepare their future. A lot of kids don't know what the future have for them because they have nothing to compare with. Through internship, they learn about the real world, they learn how to build their career, and they go back to school and rearrange their focus and get better. There are a lot of things our universities can't afford to procure in terms of tools, which they have access to in the offices. A typical example is a chemical engineer doesn't know what HYSYS does. And HYSYS is what we use to do all our processes. And at the third year level of their school, they have to be introduced to ISIS. They learn how to do drafting. This is pretty much taking the theoretical classroom to the real world in terms of marketability. And then seeing their colleagues performing on the job and building career for themselves. We've seen quite a lot, and then what we're doing as an organization is we partner with universities, whereby we buy computers and software, and we put it in the engineering department. We have one in Unilag, we have one in IFE, and we engage some of our seniors guys to go out there and teach them on how to use.
And is it enough? Is it enough to meet your needs?
No, but this is just a singular corporate social responsibility of our company. We believe if there are hundreds like that doing what we're doing, the multiplier effect can go higher. And then we're challenging the government to also invest in training the trainers. whereby they can actually bring people to universities to help them get in touch with the real world. A lot of our lecturers do not even know what exists today in terms of how to need to administer teaching to match the real world because they know very little. And so we believe Training the Trainer is another platform that could help us to increase the number of students in acquiring the right education.
Thank you. We have just over 20 minutes left, and I will turn to the audience to start the discussion very soon. But Hakeem, I'd like to turn to you for one more question before we open the floor, and that is very simple. Is this time different?
I will say that it's not a question of whether this time is different. I think this is the first time. So different from when? There was some enthusiasm at independence. All right, but after that, I can't recall. I mean, I can still remember 1985 getting a $10 million investment from Prince Al Walid in an organization that I was working in at the time, and being congratulated by the president of the Stock Exchange of Nigeria. I mean, for $10 million. So I don't think that there has been a time at which business, international business, has been enthusiastic about Africa. So this is really, the first time. I just want to add on a thought that the professor made, which is that one of the things that Lagos Business School is doing very well, and I want to compliment you for that, is in terms of real education, is the use of African case studies at business schools. Because when you really think about it, I mean, understanding the dynamics between Apple and Samsung, all right, that battle, or Apple versus Microsoft, and learning the dynamics of that competitive strategy, there's only so much that you can learn from that applies to what's going on in Kenya, Tanzania, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So the way in which Lagos Business is developing case studies on African situations, I think is very commendable. And one of the things I'm doing very much to the American business schools, Harvard Business in particular, is getting them to do more and more African-based cases. So this is a little plug for Cambridge to do the same as well.
Okay, on that note, we're gonna go into the Q&A. We have just under 20 minutes left. If you've done this before, as I'm sure most of you have, you know the rules. Keep it brief and do let us know who you are. We'll take 2-3 questions at a time and then just bounce them off the panel depending on how they go. Yes, Afua?
My name is Afua Say. I work as a business development director for the University for Executive Education. My question is to Hakeem Bello-Osagie. You mentioned about statism, and I wanted to say that state-directed capitalism seems to have served China very well. So I wonder if you could expand on your comments. And also, I would like to emphasize that the IMF encouraged African countries in the 1980s to move away from a focus on perhaps industrial policy, and this has been to the detriment of African industry. And finally, governments have served Silicon Valley very well. Silicon Valley has succeeded because of significant government investment in disruptive technologies and unfashionable technology areas. So I would like you to maybe expand on that.
Great, thank you. I'll paraphrase that question. Is the government always bad? Yes, we'll take them from the middle, from the right, and from the left. There's a lady in the middle there.
Thank you. My name is Sakina, and I'm from the LSE. My question is directed to Mr. Bello-Osagie and Professor Konedo. Your point at the beginning of your speech about having a disregard for data, I guess it's very interesting, especially for young people who are, being trained with that kind of culture. And I just wonder if it's a useful way for us to think right now, especially if we're going back to different countries and trying to see how we can improve the quality of the data that's already available. Because, whether we like it or not, data is essential to every kind of business. And so, to Professor Konedo, is there anything that Lagos Business School is doing right now in terms of, training the current students to, towards, I guess, having a certain type of culture or respect for data, or, trying to improve the quality of whatever's out there? Because I can't understand how, we should disregard information that is so crucial to the operation of businesses.
Great, thank you very much. Anybody on the left? Yes, there's a gentleman towards the back.
My name is Shogun Kubanjo from UBS. I would just like to ask the panel, specifically Mr. Belosage and Mr. Odumakinde, about the usually uncovered question of capital. I think the biggest challenge for entrepreneurs, people who are trying to inspire to come and invest in Africa, is accessing capital. And it'd be interesting to see your stories and your pointers and how that's achievable.
Great, thank you. Now, we'll leave it there, and I'll just add one more short question from Matt. I don't want him to feel left out. As a UK company, as an international company, what's unique to sort of the challenge of investing in a region like Africa if you're not a domestic company, you're not a homegrown company? What are sort of the essential things that you have to take in with you to make sure that Africa's success also becomes your success? So I'll just throw that in with the bunch. And Hakeem, we'll probably start with you because there are a couple of direct questions and any of the other issues you'd like to comment on as well.
Okay. Let me start first with the lady. Now, I said that we should disrespect data, and I said that in order to shock you and to gain your attention, which I'm happy I did. Okay. A little late in the speech, I said, and I moved from disrespect data to disrespect false data. And then I moved a little bit later in the speech, and I used the word be skeptical about data. So I'd like you to leave the room with the thought that my position is be skeptical about data until such a time when you do have accurate data. And the need for accurate statistics and to have a bigger and bigger volume of statistics covering all areas is crucial for our development. And when we get to that level, we will, in fact, have better growth rates and more opportunities. Okay? So that's that one. Now, the second question, again from the lady, is about the state. Okay. So I'd like to tell you that first and foremost, I'm probably one of the few businessmen who are actually on the left of the political framework of society. So my view is that the state is crucial for economic development. The state is crucial for economic development. The question is one of, the solution for me is one in which the state governs, all right, and private business runs business and administers. But I believe that there's a fundamental problem where you have a state that is attempting to govern, attempting to enact policy, and at the same time is running businesses. Because most states don't do it very well. All right? Now, there's nothing wrong with the state having an industrial policy. Okay, that is part of its governing. Okay, and there's nothing, and I believe it is crucial, especially in infrastructure and in areas like that, that the state plays that role. I do think that some societies, for example, China, for example, France, okay, have shown a better ability to create state entities that have been successful than others. Okay? But there are some countries which have not been able to do that. And I believe that Nigeria is a classic example of where we have never been able to do it. And I want to give you an example of a fundamental difference between Ghana and Nigeria. Take, for example, the Ghanaian Pension Fund. The Ghanaian Pension Fund has been an investor in several industries and several companies where they have acted very responsibly. If they're a 20% shareholder, they have acted as a 20% shareholder. Now, most Nigerian government entities who are shareholders, even if they are the 1% shareholder, they act like 51%. All right? So I'm also, in making that broad statement, I'd like you to get that nuance, okay? The last point I'd like to make is, for me, the bigger danger in Africa right now is not the fact that the state has not exited sufficiently, is the fact that we are increasingly beginning to see another phenomenon, which I would describe as the privatization of the state. And by the privatization of the state, I mean a situation in which leading businessmen begin to direct state activities, all right, towards enhancing the specific interests of themselves and of their companies. Okay? There must be a state that thinks of the public interest and where the country is headed as a country. Okay? So I want you to understand that for me, that is crucial. And if I have a worry, okay, it is the transformation of the state to a playground for a group of oligarchs. Now, it'd be very strange that's coming from me, but I say that in all sincerity as my view on the state. So I don't think that we are far apart from each other.
Great, thank you very much.
I don't think we're apart at all.
And I said the same issue on data.
I think that Hakeem has addressed that adequately. So what we teach the students there is precisely what he has described, to have a healthy skepticism and to be able to know what to look for. You must understand that in a lot of African countries, the data that we have is not accurate. But also in a lot of African countries, there is a shadow economy. So the data that we have comes from the formal economy. And if you realize that in several places there, that constitutes between 20 and 30% of the full economy there, you have to look for the proxies by which you can put a measure to the shadow economy. Therefore, as an MBA student, you need to know how to take this into consideration and help that to guide your decision making, not just accept that the data that you have constitutes the total economy. So this is what I think that he spoke to that, when he addressed us earlier on. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Akin, on the issue of access to finance. A nice, easy one for you.
Yes, it's been 20 years of experience on that, and Hakeem is a banker, and was a banker, still a banker, anyways. The banking sector is short-term driven investment majorly, and for most of what we do and who we compete with multinationals who have access to foreign fund, and on a long-term basis, sometimes you're talking about LIBOR plus 1.5, and in Nigerian context, from the dollar denomination, you're looking at 9, 10, 11%. He makes your business very, very non-competitive. But then if you are doing a good job, some of us are now coming of age, where multinational banks are getting involved. As we speak, a major top 3 international bank is talking to us, not just for the purpose of financing, but for the expansion of our businesses. And the equity side of the bank is where we just sign our term sheet for them to take equity in our business, to make our company not just a Nigerian company, but a sub-Saharan African company, because they've been banking in Africa for over 100 years. They understand the market, and they have a cheap fund. So this is one of those ways that some of us are pulling through the tough terms of interest rate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Matt, I've been given the timeout signal, so unfortunately we won't be able to go back for a second round, but I'd just like to get your perspectives, Matt, on anything that has been discussed so far, or the specific issue of what unique challenges do you face as a UK and international company building an Africa strategy?
Sure. Well, this conference is titled, it's not titled anything, it's titled Dispelling Myths, and I think the first thing you've got to do as an international company is free your mind of the myths that are too easily propagated about Africa. The first one is that there's any such thing as Africa. Africa is a continent of 50-odd countries with incredible diversity of prosperity, but also culture, language, and just physical size. And if you think you can run a business where one business model will work in all those different countries, then you're heading for failure very quickly. You need to build 50 local businesses that listen to local customers about what sort of products they want and how they want to buy them. It means winning the war on talent in every market and hiring the best local people to run your businesses. There's a myth, I think, also that Hakeem alluded to about corruption in Africa, that's an impediment. And I think it's important to say something about this. People often say Africa, corruption, very quickly. There's no country in the world that doesn't have corruption, and corruption is a matter of degrees. We operate very profitable businesses in some markets in Asia that, if you look at the Transparency International scores, are far more corrupt than Ghana or Zambia. The people who have difficulty with corruption, I think, are generally the ones who are confused about whether to participate in it or not. If you set out your stall from the start and make it clear to everybody involved that that's not the way you're going to do business, then we've never found it a problem in any of the markets that we operate in. What else do you do? I think you need to build your brand. You need to understand that your customers need to understand that you're committed to broader development of society and the economy. You need to have important and valuable social programs in countries. And you need to be a part of the entire economy and not just trying to grow your business.
Right. Well, I think it's an understatement to say there's a hell of a lot more to be said about the various issues we've touched on. And we haven't drilled too far down into some of the topics we've discussed, but most of the speakers on the panel will be speaking again later this afternoon, and there will be much more opportunity to explore this in more depth. On that note, we have to wrap up, but in wrapping up, by way of bringing the discussion to an end, no matter what one thinks about what's happening in Africa at the moment, whether it's the first time, whether it's different or not, how sustainable it is, it's undeniable that things are changing, and things are changing in ways that years ago not many would have anticipated, and in ways that are very compelling, depending on how you want to look at the Africa opportunity. And no doubt, in 12 months we'll reconvene, and I hope the story will have moved on. And if nothing else, the one thing I do hope is that Africa Horizon turns out not to be one of the myths that we have to tackle when considering the prospects of the continent. On that note, please join me in thanking our panelists for this morning's discussion. And I hope you have a very productive remainder of the day. Thank you.
On behalf of the Africa Business Network, we'd just like to thank our panelists again. We have some gifts for you, so I think Dolores will help us with those. Would you mind just giving them another round of applause, the great insight?